I'm happy you're all with us with International Women's Film Fest online. And I'm especially happy to welcome Emma Davie, the co-director of the documentary film Becoming Animal. Hi, Emma.
Hello, nice to be here virtually.
You are in Scotland, I believe, aren't you?
I am. I'm in the countryside in Scotland, so but let's pretend I'm nearer you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time because I know you're extremely busy and you're in the midst of preparing a new project. So see if you can remember anything from the last one.
Exactly. It seems a long time ago.
So the thematic focus of the festival is the connection between plants, humans, and other animals. And actually, our question is, what if we tried to adapt to more than human perspectives and stopped seeing humans as exceptional beings? And I was so happy when I discovered your film, Becoming Animal, because I thought every question that you tackle in this film is actually something that interests me very much also. So what you do, you introduce philosopher and writer David Abram, and he is actually our guide to get into connection with the more than human world, I'd say. And he is someone who helps us to become aware, mindful, and curious how other creatures and the land looks back to us. So for me, it was like a cinematic meditation or so, and just a perfect film to introduce our theme, the connection. So what interests me very much is your approach to stop separating humans from nature. And very early in the film, you say nature is a tricky word. Could you tell me more about it? What is tricky about this word?
Well, it's tricky about the ideas behind the word, isn't it? And maybe it's a realization or certainly a question that I had even as a child. And I think children are probably very conscious of the separation that we give as adults between us and the world around. And just in terms of how we even speak about what's around us in this more than human world. What we let into our human world, whether it's our pets, what we don't let in, whether it's other animals or um, trees or minerals or stones or whatever that we choose not to call living. So I think I was always interested in this disconnect, and it was a disconnect that I think all of us see around us and feel at a very very deep level. But I was always interested in why it happened and why we had this disconnect, even though obviously we are nature. So as soon as I begin to speaking about it, I muddle myself up into the many, many paradoxes that exist in these questions. Um, and maybe my disconnect is part of nature too. But there's no doubt, as David Abram, the philosopher who we follow in this film, he says very clearly, for 99% of our time as a species, we saw the greater world around us as animistic, as having a being, having an agency, and having an ability to communicate with us. And we lived in a world where we were part of this multi-communicative, multi-sensorial world that was just accepted as being we were part of it. We weren't the center of it. And of course, as soon as we become the center of it, everything changes and we end up with the climate disaster that we're in just now. So it's an incredibly simplistic way of describing. But I think under the sort of something almost like the banal simplicity of that statement is a certain truth that I think both Peter and I were very conscious of, which is if we are in a crisis of the environment, which of course we are, then underneath it there must be another crisis, and that crisis must be a crisis in how we see, a crisis of perception, and a crisis of imagination. So what is that crisis about? How did it arise? And David seemed a good guide to that.
Mm. Yeah, and the program that we are making is really in a search for a non-anthropocentric view, because actually that's in the middle of all of this. If you only watch as human beings, then we cannot imagine anything else. We are in the middle of a disaster already. So the question is it possible to take over this non-anthropocentric view, a view that is not human? And I believe film can offer this, and or at least we can, as filmmakers, experiment with such a gaze, Do you agree?
I do agree and I don't. I think there's limitations within that, but I think that's all part of the interest. So I agree the anthropocentric gaze is the way that actually a lot of nature films that we even love are constructed. They're constructed around a very human way of seeing the natural world. And I think part of what we were doing right at the beginning was actually trying to sink into something that didn't appear for our entertainment. So we weren't going to film, we saw this as a different kind of nature film in a way. We weren't going to film nature that was mating or nature that was necessarily fighting or nature that was doing something dramatic, but just nature that was just hanging out. And so what would happen if we took that scale of time, that scale of being, could we hold the viewer's attention? I don't know if we always could, but we certainly pushed it with absorbing ourselves in the communication of trees as they just moved slightly in the wind. And I think if you were prepared to go on the journey of the senses and let that in, then I think it's possible to feel this reciprocal communication, which I think was what we're trying to do. So although we may not be able to get into the gaze of the other, we might be able to try and at least communicate with the other. And maybe that's ultimately what film can do, is to really try and communicate with the other by looking, by taking time, by not having preconceptions about what we look at. I mean, we were very cheeky at one stage of the film, and we did really say, okay, with all the modern technology that we have the capacity to imagine that we are seeing like an animal. So let's see what would happen if we got a raven, in this instance, to fly with a camera. And we found this incredible raven called Bran, who lives in England, and who apparently is a star of some David Attenborough films. But he did a most fantastic flight for us, and he had a camera on him, and he flew really beautifully over this area of the Lake District. And it was a very special moment for us, and it was a moment where the camera spoke, and the camera and the animal, it was their collaboration, not ours. We weren't really involved in it. So that was very interesting to see how far that perspective and that gaze could actually go, which was the gaze of the machine and the animal combined.
In animal documentaries, or these typical natural documentaries, usually we see the animal and their surrounding, and usually they're breeding. I think it's always heterosexual families, but that's another thing. I'm not going to talk about it. But there's actually in their surrounding, there is usually no trace of any human beings. And in your film, you very quickly introduce also streets. The first scene is in your car, when we or very scene in your car, and you introduce also your technical equipment, as the camera equipment or technical devices, such as camera and microphones and so on. And I thought that you put your film apparatus basically in the context of your research, which is interesting,
That's very true. I think we felt that we were the filming animal with these appendages of cameras and microphones, and particularly if you turn up in this place where we were basing the film in the Grand Teton Park, it's full of people with these most fantastic cameras with lenses out to here. And we were part of this whole amazing sort of cavalcade of people that pass through looking at animals through this perspective. And so it felt like, the human animal is the recording animal just now. The animal that needs to record everything it sees, and we are that. So in a way, any question that we have about trying to get closer to nature was obviously refracted by this cinematic gaze, which had the machine at its center. And I think it's a question for the co-director Peter Mettler a lot of how the camera contains this paradox of being able to bring you closer to something, but also inherently there is a distance. And so trying to work with the technology that we had. And somebody once said a lovely thing after a screening where they felt that it was almost forgiving us for our own human manifestation as we currently are. And certainly the way that I think about it is almost like this tragicomedy of these humans still searching for meaning in this world that we've almost destroyed, and this sense of we human animal, these wee humans, they just don't really get it right, do they? And we're part of that with our cameras, trying to really see as clearly as we can and go from that as a way of being.
I just resaw your film in order to get into the mood, of your film. And I thought, very vividly that there is actually no respect from us towards everything else, we just take what we want and all this beautifulness of it all, and then we are just there for our own interests and to run over everything else, it's, it was it's very strong emotion that comes up watching your film.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I mean, I hope there's also a sense that we also have the capacity for really engaging with what's around. And, I think some people have talked about leaving the film and seeing insects differently, but not just that, suddenly feeling the seat underneath them and thinking, oh, what about its being? What about its aliveness? And just thinking differently about what we call inanimate and what we call not alive, what we call alive. Because it makes you treat everything with more respect if it has some kind of life, which is so interesting. Once we did a screening in Germany, which was really interesting. I think it was the Munich Film Festival, and at a certain stage, at the end of the screening, somebody asked a question about, what do the animals think, though? And just at that moment, we saw a mouse running around the screen, which I've never seen in a cinema before.
Yeah, she saw it. In your film, we don't only see the animals, we also hear them. I really like the first sequence when you have this massive elk and he's munching away and chewing, and we hear it, and he's looking back at us. And then, but we hear him, I think the first time I hear an elk munching in a cinema. Then we hear you guys, the filmmakers, and David Abraham, how you speak about hearing something. Like you hear something there. Maybe you hear an elk. I don't know what you hear. You wonder, and we as spectators, we experience your amazement and also your excitement about hearing. So sound is obviously a very important issue in your filmmaking, or in this film at least.
Absolutely. And there's something I just want to say about that moment where we're in the dark and we go for this walk. I was absolutely terrified because there was all these signs saying don't walk at night, there are bears. And I come from a country, we don't have bears. The most we have is kind of mad cows or something like that. So to walk in a landscape with bears was so terrifying at night. But there was this amazing sound of these elks bugling, which is this sort of galactic spatial sound that is so beautiful. And I think the thing about sound that's so interesting, the thing about vision that's so interesting, really, in terms of our perception of animals, is that the beauty of the moment of seeing, the moment of perception, is that one minute you don't hear and the next minute you hear. One minute you don't see and the next minute you see. And I think with sound, we were able to capture that sense of silence, trying to listen, and then a sound appears. And by having that sort of sense of the actual act of perception, I hope we're able to drop through cinema and through this technology, drop into that presence in that moment. Yes, but you're right. Sound was very important. And some of the sound obviously was from the moment, and others were recreated in Foley using all kinds of strange brushes and things that I can't even tell you about. I mean, we film a snail, and there's no way a snail sounds like that.
There's a book called the way the sound a snail makes munching or so, or eating. I don't know the English title. There's really a book about it, and she seems to make a sound because the person who wrote the book, she heard it. No, but that's another thing.
That book, we just imagined what it would be like and created it out of some very strange sounds. But anyway, yeah.
The title of the film Becoming Animal is obviously a book, book title from David Abram himself, but what does it signify for you, this becoming animal, this active position?
Yeah.
Who is becoming animal?
Well, I think we all need to become animal, really. I think we have to remember that we are part of the animal kingdom, and that, we're not above it, we're part of it. So I think becoming animal is somehow becoming more human, actually, in a funny kind of way. Maybe in order to understand our full humanity, we have to remember our animal nature and go from that place. Our animal nature in its openness to other animals and to the world around. Yeah. So I think for me it's that, but for me it's also the question of this question of reciprocity in our perception, and to what extent by really looking and really engaging with our senses and what's around do we actually almost become it. I think it's a very interesting question, to what extent you actually are able to rise above yourself and transcend the human when you're in nature, and how much cinema enables that is a fascinating question, and the moral and ethical implications of that in terms of how we then treat what we see is so interesting.
Exactly, because I really think that animal can make animal that that film can make a shift in our attitude towards the other world, beside us. I really believe it, because I think that really an emancipated way of looking at the world, which would be more than human gaze, for me, that really opens up critical views of changeable social structures. We can change something, and it offers also utopian visions, I think, because in the end of the day, if we treat the other equal to us, or we don't treat each other well as human beings either, but anyway, if we treat them equal to ourselves, there is a really good chance for all players to have a better life. And I think that film can be part of it, like any other discipline. Science is part of it, of course, sociology, philosophy, obviously, because we listen to a philosopher, isn't it?
But I think that's so right, Betty, and I think in a way we haven't really fully discovered what film can do in terms of that yet. And this is a really interesting question. Film isn't just that film can be in a way part of this journey to really deeply reconnect, and part of this journey to really deeply question, and to heal in a way, because there's healing required in order to. And if I sound new age and hippie, I say that with the understanding that if we don't change, we're heading for such disaster. So we have to actually change. I mean, we did this screening, interestingly enough, just at the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, the very important international movement of protest. And I remember they came back from the first protest. A lot of people in Glasgow came into a screening and said, we look at your film and we ask ourselves, should we stop protesting and just be? And I don't have an answer to that. I think we have to do both. I think we have to do it all. But I think there's a danger that if we don't do it without the reconnection, that it doesn't come from a place that actually also nurtures us. Because to reconnect is to nurture us, and to look and to be and to engage in that level is to also feel feel what we were born to feel, of course, as human beings, which is part of something, not the center of something. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm very grateful for your film because, as you might imagine, I've seen much for this program, The Connection, and a lot of films now are totally dystopian, they show us the big destruction, like Anthropocene, this and that, and there's a hole here and another earthquake is doing the rest of it, and or there's these nature films with happy animals who breed, there's and I think both doesn't help, because the one thing is escapism, and the other thing is really, it's so depressing that you're, it's like the game over narrative, more or less, which is important in a sense, but it leaves you with, you leaves you like a zombie, actually, and I think what you did is very good, that you're not running away from the problem that is there, but still you offer something else, and this connection, I think, is your great, it's a gift, to be able to find it somehow.
It seems very important. Yeah, we had a bit of a rule that we never mention climate change in the film.
Yeah, well, it's there. We don't have to mention it. We know about it.
We don't have to mention it at all, do we?
Yeah.
It's in our minds so often and all the time, and should be too. But we just said we don't mention it. We leave it to the audience.
Yeah, no, it is in the film, I think. So, yeah. Well, I have one last question. Did you grow up in the countryside or something? Were you in the middle of it all as a child?
Oh, I wish I had been. I always wanted to be. I am now. But as a child, no, I was the kind of kid that would go wandering if ever we were, I lived by a field, but it was in the town. But I would always go wandering in nature, and felt that hills were my relatives, I think, from a very young age.
And as you said, nature's everywhere, we're part of it, even in the city.
We're part of it, yeah. These computers, everything.
It's also nature, yeah. So, Emma, thank you so much. I regret so much that you cannot come to Dortmund, but it was lovely to speak to you about your work.
Dortmund another time. Thank you so much, Betty, for your interest and your observations. I really enjoyed speaking to you. Okay, thanks. All the best. Bye-bye.